I have, right, okay, we're recording. So I have Tara here to kind of help me monitor the chat. So if you have any questions as we go through, you can add them to the chat and we will talk about them at the end. So this class is from 9 to 11. And so I do need you to attend the majority of the class, so about 45 minutes of each hour, and respond to both of the poll questions to get CEC credit. So I just wanted to put that out there, but other than that, we will go ahead and start. So most of you probably know me. I'm Cheyenne. I'm the NFIP specialist with KDA. And so today we're going to be talking about so the first half of this 4-hour class that we've split into this morning and then tomorrow morning, basically an overview of the program. And so it's basically aimed at beginner floodplain managers. We do have some more seasoned people that like to attend just to kind of do a brush up on the basics. So we'll start with a basic overview of the program. Sorry. So we'll start with an overview of the program and why we regulate floodplains, and then we'll go through all of the mapping topics and how to calculate a BFE and reviewing permits and applications and other construction documents that are needed for the NFIP. Concerns for accessory and agricultural structures and other types of structures, and just kind of the basics that we would be looking for as far as compliance. Pre and post firm buildings, which kind of ties into substantial improvements and substantial damage and the different requirements for those. A little bit about flood insurance and how it's changed, and the different components of that. Enforcing and dealing with violations, doing inspections and investigations, technical aspects of regulating the floodplains, as I said, maps and technical forms, and where to get additional information. Okay, so the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968 is what established this program. So that is when the NFIP was established, and basically it's a program that provides federally subsidized flood insurance for communities that voluntarily enact land use control and regulations that comply with the NFIP and ensure that things are going to be built safely in the floodplain. And so prior to 1968, we just had disaster relief funding and disaster loans that were used to help people recover from large disasters, which was not financially stable for the federal government. And so they wanted to start making people more responsible themselves for their own construction in the floodplain and to recover from those larger disasters. So this was originally under the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government before it was moved over to FEMA. So that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency that now manages the program. And some of this started, kickstarted some changes in the program in 1972 when Hurricane Agnes on the East Coast damaged thousands of homes and injured lots of people. And so very few people at that time had taken advantage of this program and had flood insurance. And so that's when they introduced the mandatory purchase requirement. So that was 1973 that they introduced the mandatory purchase requirement. And basically, if you have a federally backed mortgage, then you have to have flood insurance. And that can apply even if the community does not participate in the program. As I said, it's a voluntary program. And so a lot of people were relying on disaster assistance. And so the average FEMA individual assistance payout is about $5,000, whereas the average flood insurance claim is around $30,000. So it is an important part of recovery. People sometimes just assume they'll get disaster assistance, and that doesn't always happen. It's not always a federally declared disaster, and they still might not qualify. So This was, again, as a result of Hurricane Agnes in 1972. So you can see the path of this storm as it made landfall on the East Coast and then went back into the ocean and then made landfall again. So this was a large disaster that the government determined that people need to have flood insurance if they have a federally backed mortgage. And so it's basically like they don't want to, invest federal money in something that's not insured. So that is an important aspect of the program that was introduced at that point. And these numbers reflect that storm and any of the spin-off tornadoes that happened as a result of that. So one of our larger disasters at the time. And so again, it is a voluntary program where the community applies and passes legislation per their level of risk in their community. So it depends on what kind of flood zones they have on the level of regulations that they have to adopt, but they apply to become part of this program and then enact those land use requirements. So that would be typically the floodplain management ordinance that is passed and adopted by the community. Sometimes it is a zoning regulation, wherever it exists in the authority of that jurisdiction, of that community. And so again, the mandatory purchase requirement prohibits federal money from being spent in the special flood hazard area in non-participating communities. So it's kind of a voluntary program that has conditions where they will put sanctions on you if you have floodplains and then you don't participate. There is no federal NFIP flood insurance. Obviously, there's no mortgage insurance, no grants or disaster assistance that are federal. It can lower housing values in that community. So there's a lot of incentive for communities that have special flood hazard areas to participate. And so here's just kind of a comprehensive list of what happens if a community does not participate. The governing body could be held liable at a later date. Actuarial rates are still in effect, and so things that are built out of compliance can become very expensive to insure later on. So there are these conditions if you don't participate. So here are some acronyms, and I've probably already used some of these. These are common ones that we use all the time in floodplain management. So you will see me using these throughout our presentation. BFE is base flood elevation, and so we'll talk quite a bit about that. The elevation certificate, EC, FHBM, flood hazard boundary map. So this is an older style map, so I won't be talking about it much, and you probably won't really be working with them unless you do have quite an older map. The FIS, which is the flood insurance study, we will talk about that more. FIRM and DFIRM, so the flood insurance rate map. DFIRM is the digital one, so these are the modern maps that are created. FEMA, as we covered, the Emergency Management Agency, and then NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program, and then SFHA, Special Flood Hazard Area, which ties back into base flood. And so we have these interchangeable terms, and they basically mean all of the same thing. You have the 1% annual chance flood, 100-year flood, regulatory flood, or SFHA. They all mean the same thing, which is the 1% annual chance flood that could be equaled or exceeded in any given year. So this is the national standard that the NFIP regulates to, and we tried to avoid saying 100-year flood because some people confuse that with an understanding that it's something that happens only once every 100 years, which is not accurate. It is the 1% annual chance flood. It's just another way of saying that probability. But again, all of these are basically interchangeable terms, and I will probably be using several of them throughout the presentation. And as I said, it's a probability. Every flood we have is a gamble. Some are larger than that, some are smaller than that. And so this is a compromise between a government taking, which means that we would be preventing land from being used in an unreasonable way. So if we just kept all development out of the floodplain, that would be ideal for flooding issues, but obviously people want to be able to use the land around them, including the floodplain. So what we want to do is discourage development in the floodplain so that we can keep those open for the conveyance of floodwater. But we have these regulations that say if you're going to develop in the SFHA that you have to meet these performance standards. And so again, 1% is the compromise between taking and just having completely unregulated development. And as I said, every flood is a gamble, and weather patterns are becoming more erratic with unpredictable and extreme weather patterns. So we do need to take flooding issues seriously, which is the goal of the NFIP, is improving resilience and reducing flood losses. And so this is the riverine floodplain. This is typically what we have in Kansas, the most common type of floodplain that we have. And so this is how it's mapped. So this is kind of a cross-section area. It looks like we're standing in the stream channel. So you can see the stream bed here, the surface of the water. And so we have the floodway in the center, which is the stream channel, and it's directly adjacent areas that have even higher standards for development in these areas. We try to discourage that as well. And then outside of that is the flood fringe. And so altogether it is the 100-year floodplain, the SFHA, or the 1% annual chance flood. Again, all words for the same thing. So this is how it's mapped. So this is basically the same image, but it shows you that we have simulated encroachment until the surcharge of the water is 1 foot, and then that is where we draw the line. That's how it's delineated for the flood fringe and the floodway as well. So basically we're squeezing and displacing water as we have encroachment and development, which causes a rise in the surface elevation. And that is because base flood elevations do change with encroachment. We get complaints about people adding fill, which can worsen flooding. And we don't like more than 1 foot of water. So that is how it's mapped. And then in Kansas statewide, we have a 1 foot of freeboard requirement. So that is a higher standard than the NFIP minimum, which is to have the lowest floor of residential and non-residential buildings to or above the base flood elevation. So we have a statewide standard that's a little bit higher than that, and some communities adopt even higher standards of freeboard, but everyone in Kansas has at least 1 foot of freeboard adopted. So that is a state law. And so why do we bother regulating the floodplains? As I mentioned, the goal of the NFIP is to reduce flood losses, which means people and property, so loss of life and property damage. We'd like to reduce that. Ensure that federal flood insurance is available, again, making sure that people are taking responsibility for developing in high-risk areas, and reducing federal spending on those types of structures, saving tax dollars in that way, avoiding liability and lawsuits. So as I mentioned, a community can be held liable for not protecting their people in the special flood hazard area. And so we need to enact reasonable safety standards. All of our ordinances say health, safety, and general welfare. It's a required statement in the ordinance as per the Code of Federal Regulations. And again, reducing flood losses specifically in Kansas, because that's where we are, but nationwide, it's a federal program. And of course, our first responders are the people that have to go out and do water rescues during floods. And so we have seen some of them lost in Kansas during flooding. During one flood, there were teens that went white water rafting, quote. So they were just trying to have fun in the floodwater, and then we ended up losing a volunteer fireman that had to go out and rescue them. And so when people don't want to comply with regulations, they're not thinking about the danger that they might be putting themselves in, or future owners of their properties, or the first responders that might have to come out and do a water rescue. And so the same line of thinking goes with not wanting to get an insurance policy because they don't have a loan, so they don't have a mandatory purchase requirement. But we have seen complete flood losses of a structure, and it is a complete loss. Flooding is a very expensive type of disaster to go through, and so people can lose their entire life's investment in a structure because of flooding and not having insurance. So flooding is dangerous. The number one reason for deaths during a flood is people driving into floodwater. It's very common. That's why we have turnaround, don't drown signs. So making sure people are aware of the actual danger that flooding presents is an important part of floodplain management, and helping people understand why we have these regulations in place that they have to comply with. So the number two reason for deaths during a flood is electric shock. It's also an extremely common hazard during flooding. 6 inches of moving water can knock someone down, and about 2 feet of water is enough to float a car. So it is a present danger, and it is, serious. So just something to keep in mind when you do have to explain this to people, and for when you're working on floodplain management. That is kind of the the bottom line and the important part. So I will move more into the mapping side of things. And so these are our regulatory documents that we use to regulate the floodplain. This is the regulatory document that tells us exactly where the floodplain is and where those regulations apply. So again, this is the FIRM, the flood insurance rate map. So this is the FEMA product. And we have any number of ongoing projects at any time throughout the watersheds in the state. So what type of map is it, FIRM? It will tell you there. If it was a flood hazard boundary map, it would state that at the top. The community name is there kind of in the center of this title block. So this is the title block of the map, and it will give you most of the information that you would need to know to verify, like section B of the elevation certificate and someone's permit application for their map information. Is most of it's here. There's a small site diagram, so it's just kind of a sketch of where this panel is located in relationship to the whole county-wide mapping. The community number, so that is a 6-digit number, and you can see that across from the community name. So it's a 6-digit number, and all of the numbers in Kansas start with 200. So the City of Solomon, 200,077, the number of revisions. So if you look towards the bottom where it says map number, that is the full map number and panel number. And then the letter C is the suffix that tells you how many times it's been revised. So ABC, that's 3 times. And then the effective date at the bottom is the date that this map went effective and became the regulatory document. So our rules only apply in the areas of floodplain. So again, this is the authoritative document that tells us where the rules apply. And so the panel number, that's kind of in the middle where it says panel 61 of 220. That's an abbreviation and not what you're looking for when documents ask for the map and panel number. You should be looking at the full number, which is at the bottom, 20041, and then C is for county-wide, and then 0061. So that's the full map and panel number, and then the suffix next to it. Just an FYI, that is a mistake that we see pretty often. And so I'll walk through where to find these maps on the Map Service Center and a few other digital services that are available if you have a digital map, and then making the Fermet, which is a smaller zoomed in version of the FIRM panel. So the different flood zones that we have, so the base flood elevation can be found on the firms of an area that has a detailed study. And so these are rounded numbers, and we don't use them for verifying compliance or any of our elevation documents or applications or anything like that. They're just kind of for reference. And so you kind of have an idea of what the base flood elevation is in different areas of these detailed studies. So you can see them there. They're kind of written on squiggly lines, whereas the actual cross sections there, so the little hexagons that have numbers in them, those are cross sections that do actually have a calculated base flood elevation that is to within 1/10 of a foot. And so base flood elevations need to be within 1/10 of a foot, and we will talk about that more. But the flood hazard zones that we have here, to start with, a zone AO. So that is a shallow flooding area. It's for sheet flow. I don't think there's one in this diagram, but those areas actually have a flood depth instead of a base flood elevation. And so they regulate using the depth above grade, whereas a zone AE, which is what is shown here, is an area that has base flood elevations calculated. And so those are based on base flood elevation instead of a depth. And then you have a shaded zone X. So that is drawn here. That is the 500-year floodplain. It's considered moderate risk. It's not regulatory, so it's not considered to be a regulatory floodplain unless it's specifically adopted by the community. And communities are encouraged to adopt higher standards than the NFIP minimums. And then you have zone X unshaded. And so that is all other areas considered to be low risk. So they are outside of the floodplain. Of course, everywhere has a flood risk of some type. And then the floodway that we talked about is kind of the stream line or the stream bed and the adjacent areas that are used to convey floodwaters. That is the diagonal crosshatching areas. And so that's how it's depicted on all the different firms. And as I said, we'll look at a couple different ones. But this is the basic elements that you'll see on a floodplain map. And so this is a drawn paper map. So this is kind of like the older style maps that they used to have, whereas a lot of places now, especially in eastern Kansas, have digital maps. So that's what this looks like. So this is one version of the digital map. This is from the Map Service Center. So if you go to search all products, and I will walk you through that, this is the type of map that you'll get. So unshaded zone X. In this version of the map, you have an aerial photograph for the background, and then you have zone A, which is an approximate floodplain area. So it is regulatory floodplain that does not have the BFEs calculated. It's not a detailed study area. And so we have to have different methods, or the developer will have to find a way to develop that base flood elevation. And I will go through some different resources that we have for that, but it's not a detailed study area. Whereas the zone AE, you can see it has a cross section and it has the BFEs calculated. And so that's where we would use the flood insurance study to determine what the base flood elevation is for a specific location. And then the floodway, again, has the diagonal crosshatching, and it's depicted the same way there. It's in white. And then the base flood elevation, again, they're rounded numbers, so we don't use them from the actual map. We would go to the flood insurance study. As it says there, consult the flood insurance study profiles and the tables for the accurate elevations. Again, shaded zone X here, it's drawn in black as the 500-year floodplain, and then the cross sections there. So basically the same thing. And then this is how it's done on the National Flood Hazard Layer. So this is the FEMA National Geo Database, the GIS that you can look at for nationwide maps. And so we have a different state version of this, but this is just another different color scheme. This one is to help those with color blindness, but we have all of the same zones and information. So you have the jurisdictional boundaries of the city of Wichita. The diagonal crosshatching for the floodway here is in this kind of blue and red scheme. The AE zone is in blue. The 500-year floodplain is in orange. And then you have the area of kind of orange and black striping. That is an area that is protected by a certified levee. And so it's considered to not be in the floodplain there. So we will talk a little bit more about certified levees and people behind them. So again, they're considered to not be in the floodplain. So they wouldn't have a mandatory purchase requirement, which can cause issues. But again, we will talk more about flood insurance later on. So this is the MAP Service Center, and this is the main place to get flood maps that are effective. And they also have historic products. And this is where you would also get the flood insurance study. And so if you have digital maps, you can just kind of use the address bar here and just type in a specific place, and it will pull it up on the National Flood Hazard layer, which is again a map that would look like this, which is perfectly fine. If you don't have digital maps, you would use the search all products and then go about it that way, which is a little bit slower, but either method will bring up the effective map. And so this is kind of where we are. As far as mapping, this is the mapping status as of this past October. And so you can see we have ongoing projects statewide. So even this is a little bit out of date. We make progress daily on making new maps, and we are working towards getting everyone a digital map, but it does take quite a bit of time. And so I will talk more about our state projects, but we should have base level engineering available statewide by this June. And so that kind of ties back into Zone A floodplains that we will continue to discuss. And so, as I said, if you have a digital map, you can pull it up using the address search bar. So I have pulled up our office address in Topeka. And so we are not in the floodplain, but we are adjacent to it. So you can see all of the different floodplain features there. You have our jurisdictional boundaries, the full map and panel number and effective date here. So this is fully useful for making a ferment, for looking at an ongoing project for an area. And so if you use this, you might want to type in the zip code to help narrow down the location. But if I wanted to make a ferment for our office building here, I can just click on dynamic map, which is right there in the center of the page. And then it will just generate a map for me that has all of that information and a very detailed legend that has all of the different flood zones on it, the cross sections and all of these different features and most of the mapping information that I would need. And so we just encourage you to make a ferment if the applicant hasn't already produced one and attached it with their application. And this is something you would want to save on file with their property file and all of their documentation as related to floodplains, so applications and all of that information so that you have a clear idea of the effective floodplain at the time that it was applied for, and documenting past construction because floodplain maps do change over time. They are updated. So anyways, you can see the red arrow there. That's our office and all of the information that we would need. So this is a really useful tool. Again, if you have a digital map, if not, you can just go to search all products and it will take you here. You just put in Kansas, put in the county that it's located in and the community name. Then you just hit search and there you have the list of effective products. And so that's your map panels and your flood insurance study. And then there you can see any preliminary products that are up and coming for a project, any pending products, and then the historical products, which can be useful for looking at past maps that may have been in effect at a time when different development was done. But here's the firm panels. And so there's usually quite a few panels, for large communities. If it's unincorporated area, there's definitely going to be a lot of panels. And so the first product here we have is the index. So you can see it says CIND for index. And so if you're not sure what panel you're looking for, this is a good place to start. It's just kind of an overview of the different panels that are in this countywide project. So you have these larger landmarks like railroads and rivers and highways that you can use to narrow down your specific location. And then once you find your map panel, then you know which one you'll be working with. And so this is an older style index for Lawrence. This is what it looks like now as it's digitalized. Here's another example. City of Topeka is there in the center. So this is Shawnee County. And then this is Chase County that just went effective last year. So just a couple of examples of index maps. And so once you go back to your firm panel, effective firm panels, then you find, of course, the appropriate panel, and then you can open it. And so it's quite large, it's pretty zoomed out, which is why we have the format option so that we can kind of zoom in on our area of interest. And so it's a simple process. You just click on create format. Then you pick your page size. You want to pay attention to that if you're going to end up printing it out or something, that you would print it out to actual size so that you preserve the map scale, but default 8x11. And then you would click next and it says select print area. And so that's where you would drag that green box over your area of interest. Then you click next, and then the boxes for the title block and the north arrow in the scale will light up so that you can adjust those how you like. And then once you have all of that adjusted, you just hit preview format. So then you just make sure you like the preview, and then you can download it. So it's pretty straightforward. And that's what you would have to do if you have an older style map. So again, the newer ones have an aerial photograph in background. It's not a drawing, but whatever you have for your effective product, that's what you would be using. And so it looks very similar to the National Flood Hazard Layer. It still has all of that effective information, and you can see the cross sections. And so this is a much better version of the map to be working with than the full map panel that has a little bit too much detail in it. Okay, and then the flood insurance study. So as I said, under effective products, it'll say FIS report, and that's what you would be using. If you get an application for development in an area that has a detailed study, we're going to want to look at the base flood elevation that's provided to you. We can't just accept base flood elevations that are given to us, even by licensed professionals. They do make mistakes. Some of them don't work very frequently with floodplain stuff. And so we just want to check their work and make sure that it makes sense. And if you just needed to check a base flood elevation at a particular site, I have helped people calculate their base flood elevations just to give them an idea if they might want to get a survey for a LOMA. And so this is something useful to know how to do for doing floodplain management. And so when you look at the flood insurance study, it's quite long. They might give it to you in several different files on the MSC. And so for the base flood elevations, we're looking at the riverine flood profile. And so again, we're working with riverine stuff today. There's a different set of rules if it's like a reservoir or a lake type of floodplain. And so I can work with anyone who has any questions about something like that. But for riverine floodplains, they have the flood profiles. And so you'll find these towards the end of the document. And so just make sure that you're looking at the right one. So they will be labeled with the name of that flooding source. And then it has, as you can see, just kind of a graphed out depiction of the same thing that you're seeing on the map. And it gives you the cross sections at the bottom. You can see the stream bed, and then above that you have the flood frequencies. And so of course we're interested in the 100-year flood, but it does have those other frequencies there available, and you can see that on the legend. And so it's just, another kind of graphical representation of the map. So what we're going to be interested in is the cross-section that is upstream to that particular site. And if we're talking about a structure, that would be the upstream corner of the structure. And so I'm going to go through an example of this with a fictional project. But I do have other recordings of me going through a more paper map version. We also have a few recordings of one of our mapping specialists going through this and doing that in GIS, which is another useful class if you'd want to see that. Okay, so this is my fictional project. This is 1205 Brook Street. This is in Lawrence. And so I am along this stream. You can see where I've kind of pinpointed it on the left and then zoomed into what would be the building footprint on the right. And so this is Brook Street tributary. It's an upstream tributary to the Kansas River. So you can see where there's a confluence with another tributary there, and then it flows into the Kansas River right there. And so I'm kind of hypothetically going to put a building here, and so we would need to know what the base flood elevation is for this particular site, and every site is going to have its own base flood elevation. So I have had some confusion about that, like there would be a base flood elevation for an entire area or an entire community. It has to be calculated for the specific site because it will change as you even move to a different section on the same property. So every site specifically is going to have its own base flood elevation. So I just wanted to make that clear. And so you can see I'm between two cross sections. So I've pulled this one up on the National Flood Hazard layer. It's the same site, but it has the different style of mapping. And you can see where I've kind of pinpointed it. It's not as clear because this aerial photograph has a more leaf on, whereas this one is a little bit more leaf off, so you can see the actual ground. But in this one as well, you can see I'm between two cross sections very faintly. I turned down the opacity so that we could see a little bit better the background, which you can do if you pull all of your data into GIS. You can work with it a little bit differently. So that is a useful tool that you can use to calculate base flood elevations or look at an area. But I'm between two cross sections, and so the cross section on the bottom, which is at 826.1, that's my upstream cross section. It's cross section C, and that's what we're interested in. As I said, the upstream cross section. And then the downstream cross section towards the top is at 825.4. And we're interested in the upstream because that's the higher number. And we always have to use the most conservative base flood elevation to make sure that it's actually, high enough. So Lawrence actually has a 2 foot of freeboard standard that things have to be built to. And so again, this is the same information. I have the map and panel number, the effective date, and all these other layers that I could use. If you are going to be in GIS, just be aware of your projection because that can cause distortion. And so here I'm actually using a Kansas projection for that. So, if I was using paper maps and this was a drawn map, I would have to measure my precise location using other landmarks such as the center of streets, the distance to different, maybe an adjacent building, something that I can use to measure out my precise location, which is a little bit more difficult if you don't have that digital data, where GIS has like measurement tools and things that just make it easier. And so again, I do have paper map examples. It's just a little bit less easy and probably a little bit less precise than it would be, as a digital map, which is why they've started making them. They're a little bit more accurate. So again, preserving the mapping scale, making sure everything is in the same datum. So when you're reviewing information in applications, making sure everything is in the same datum, because if they are different, then that can definitely cause issues with the elevations. And so This is NAVD 88, the older styles NGVD 29, and it's less accurate, but if you have an older map, it could be in a different datum. And so just checking to make sure all of that is consistent is an important part of reviewing applications and working with maps. So I just wanted to put that out there. And so to measure this, I am doing my best to draw a line that is 90 degrees from my upstream corner of my structure to the profile baseline. And that's how you would do it in GIS with this digital data. And so what I'm looking for is where this perpendicular line intersects with the profile baseline, that yellow line that's going vertical, that intersection and the distance between that to that upstream cross section. So I have that distance right there, and that's what I'm going to measure to calculate my base flood elevation. Again, be aware of the projection because this is how we measure it. And we're always measuring along the streamline. So if this was a more of a meander area of the floodplain of the stream, then I would be measuring along that profile baseline and following the curvature of the stream. So that's another important aspect of doing this. So here I've used the measurement tool in GIS to measure what that distance is to the upstream cross section, and I have a distance of 21 feet just using the distance measure tool. And so I know that I am 21 feet downstream from cross section C. And so this is the flood profile that I've pulled out of the flood insurance study. So you can see it has Brook Street tributary there. Again, you want to make sure that you're using the right stream source, the right profile. A lot of streams in a community will have very similar sounding names, like Turkey Creek and then Little Turkey Creek tributary, stuff like that. So just double checking that, making sure it is the right area and it aligns with what you're seeing on the map. So cross section C, you can see at the bottom, and that's where I'm going to be focusing my measurements on. And so it can be a little bit counterintuitive that the profiles kind of run from right to left, where the right side is upstream, and so the direction of flow is right to left. It's a little bit counterintuitive when we typically read left to right. And so as you saw on the map, cross-section B is at 825.4, and then cross-section C is at 826.1. And so we're going to use those values to check our work as we calculate this, and I will show you the floodway data tables that have that information. But as we zoom in on the flood profile and look at cross sections B and C, there's this 10 by 10 grid here, and then it says 400 to 800. So that's 10 squares that are 400 feet apart. And so each small square is a 40-foot interval. And so, as I said, I'm going to be trying my best to measure exactly where my site is by measuring 21 feet downstream from cross section C. And so you can see there's a little bit of a judgment call here, and just doing the best we can to be precise with doing these measurements. And at most, the licensed professional is the one that is responsible for signing their name and their seal to their elevation certificates, and when the applicants are providing us information. And so we just want to make sure that they are doing this accurately and that we are permitting things that are actually built in compliance and high enough. So again, I'm checking that. I'm also checking the distance between the two cross sections just to make sure that it lines up with what I'm seeing in the profile. And it does, that distance works out. It's 160 feet. And it works out, when I look at the flood profile. It's not common that we find errors in the mapping or the flood profiles, but it can happen. So just making sure that we have the full context of what we're measuring and does it make sense with what we're seeing on the flood profiles. So just kind of doing our due diligence here to make sure that everything is looking on the up and up. So you can see I've drawn my line from cross section C I've done my best to kind of go 21 feet downstream. And so again, there's a little bit of a judgment call there. It should be pretty close to whatever anyone else is getting. So no matter what method you're using, it should be pretty close in number that you get. So this is about the distance of one half of those smaller boxes. Because as I said, they're 40 feet, so about halfway would be 20 feet, and I'm doing my best to try to get 21 feet downstream of that. And so once I've pinpointed that location, I just drag the line all the way up through the flood frequencies that we looked at earlier. And of course, my interest is where that line intersects with the 100-year flood elevation. And then once I find that intersection, I pinpoint it and then just draw the line horizontally all the way across to the other side. So the y-axis is my elevations in feet. And so again, we're working with this 10 by 10 grid. On the y-axis, we have 5 feet for 10 boxes. So it's 1 foot for every 2 squares. And so the number that I'm seeing here is about 826.1. It's a little bit above the 826 line. And yeah, I might want to round up, but I feel like it might be a little bit unfair for me to round it up if the upstream area that I'm looking at, that cross section is at 826.1. I should probably just keep it there, but I don't think that the base flood elevation there has gone down. So between 160 feet, it's going down only like less than 1 foot. So I think it's reasonable and it makes sense with what I'm seeing here that the base flood elevation for this site would still be 826.1. So that's what I would call it. And that's what I would say. As the floodplain manager, you do have the authority to kind of round up on that just to make sure that people are being safe. But that's typically how that's done in a Zone E area. We talked about unnumbered A zones. And so again, these are approximate. They don't have the base flood elevation calculated. And so the developer will have to do that themselves and find a way of doing that. As I mentioned, we have the the state site. So this is, it's like the National Flood Hazard Layer, but it's just for Kansas. And so when you pull it up, you can see where we have the digital firms. And so those counties are highlighted in green. And then it's the same information. And this is the service that I was using in the GIS. So this is a little bit faster. People have issues with the National Flood Hazard Layer running slower. So I recommend using this. And we have about just as many tools and features and other layers that you can turn on and off that might help you. Another thing we have in here that's an advantage is the Zone A data. We have the cross sections in there that were used to create the approximate map. And so we have that available as like best available data to help developers. So this is what it looks like. This is a Zone A area and we have that data available, whereas the National Flood Hazard Layer wouldn't have that. And so if you just go to the print function on the lower left side, it might be hard to see on this slide, but if you click that, you can kind of make your own fermet, which is basically the same service that I showed you before on the MSC and the National Flood Hazard Layer. And so this is something useful that can be used to support them creating a base flood elevation for an approximate floodplain and in support of a LOMA application or as part of the elevation certificate. And then we have that disclaimer at the bottom that this is developed by KDA. And then the Kansas BFE portal. So something else we have that is really helpful for Zone A requests. You can request a base flood elevation be calculated. And so you just create a profile here, and then you can go in on the map, draw a polygon, and then submit a request in a Zone A. So we have that service available. You can also click around and look at the approximate LiDAR. And we send this out to property owners all the time for them to be able to look at their approximate elevation and have that in support of them determining whether they should get a survey, if it's worth them trying to apply for a LOMA. It can help them decide if they might be a good candidate or not. And the Zone A requests go through our mapping specialist. It's not an automated thing. They process these requests and then they will calculate it for you. And that's only for Zone A approximate areas, not the detailed study areas. Those tell you to consult the flood insurance study like we just did. And so that's a helpful tool. And as I said, we should have base level engineering statewide in about 6 months. And so then we could calculate a base flood elevation for an area anywhere in the state. So that's really exciting, and that's helpful to developers and property owners. So again, the different flood zones, the Zone A, no base flood elevation is determined, but it is special flood hazard area. The AE zone does have the base flood elevations. As I mentioned, AO and AH, which is sheet flow and shallow flooding, they have flood depths instead of elevation, and that's how they are regulated. They are trying to phase those out in new mapping. So we'll probably be seeing less of those in new maps. Zone AR, not something you'll see very often. It's an area that has a flood protection system like a levee that's in the process of being restored. Zones B and C are the older versions of shaded and unshaded Zone X. So if you see that, that's what it means. It's moderate and low risk areas. So those would be considered not floodplain. And then Zone D is an unstudied area where flood hazards are possible, but they're not determined. And we don't have any of those in Kansas, but just something to be aware of. So the flood maps are issued by FEMA, and in turn, you can get certain special letters of map change that will officially take out a structure or a property or a section of property from the floodplain legally, and that means that the floodplain rules would not apply and the mandatory purchase requirement would not apply. So you have the LOMA, which is the most common. So this is a letter that says natural grade, so the natural ground that this property or this structure is on is actually higher ground, and it's actually out of the floodplain. It's to or above the base flood elevation. And so this is, again, the most common. It's common for property owners to apply for this. And similarly, the LOMAR F. So the third one down is a letter of map revision based on fill. And basically it says that you've put in fill and that has taken this out of the floodplain. Whereas the LOMAR is usually a larger swath of land. It's a bigger project. And you're physically changing the map. So the LOMAR F, basically you are altering the map, and so there are fees associated with them, whereas the LOMA is free. And then the PMR is like a huge like remapping project where one or more panels are revised at request of the community. So that's a bigger, longer project that takes about 18 months. And then the LOMA out as shown is a different type of LOMA that we will talk about in a couple of slides, but just real quick, again, the LOMA on the left here is on natural ground, whereas on the right, it's on fill. So that's the LOMAR F, where you are revising the map by adding fill, whereas the LOMA, it's on natural grade, so you're actually making a correction to the map. It was already higher ground, it shouldn't have been mapped in, but it was, and so that's why it's free. So the LOMA out as shown, basically you could have floodplain on your property and then the lender, third-party determination company will say that it's in the floodplain because it's on the property. And so if the structure is out and it's not touching the floodplain, it's considered to be out. And so to get rid of the mandatory purchase requirement, you can file a LOMA to just show that it's actually mapped outside the floodplain. And so that's what you have here, where the duplex 3414 and 3412, their lender might say that they were in the floodplain, but they're clearly not. It's just in the backyard. And so you have the LOMA MTEZ application, and then FEMA has these instructions on how to do it. And so you just take the MTEZ and you just fill it out as they say here. You're just kind of writing an OAS for out as shown on a lot of it, and then providing the information. You have a deed attached to it and a community map, like from your GIS department. And so you just submit that information and they will give you a LOMA OAS out as shown. So that's just a different version of it. Again, levies that are accredited are federal, and they have these certain standards that they have to meet, this design criteria, which is freeboard, closures, plans for emergency operation, and maintenance and regular operation. So there's a lot that goes into certifying a levy. It's very expensive. It can be hard to do. You're constantly having to maintain it and deal with erosion and other types of issues. And so if a levy fails or is overtopped, it's a pretty major disaster. And we have had situations like this, like in 2007, Coffeyville, the water overtopped the levee and then 400 houses were flooded at once. And so it was a 1 in 2,500 event, larger than the 1% annual chance flood. And so 400 houses were flooded, and then a refinery left a valve open. And so 100,000 gallons of oil got into the water. And so it completely demolished those houses. They were completely lost. And then the refinery had to buy them out. So it's kind of an issue, I've been told, of when the levy will fail, not if it will fail. So it's kind of a big deal. People will have a false sense of protection behind them because they can fail on a clear day, and then you would have, a major disaster on your hands. So levies are a pretty big deal. There's a lot of investment that goes into that. And so, yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do now is launch the first poll question. And again, I need you to answer both of the poll questions in order to receive the 2 CECs credit today. And then we'll take a very quick 5-minute break. So the question is, when was the NFIP established? And so I'll give you about another 30 seconds or so to go ahead and answer that. And then we'll go over the answer and then take a quick break before we get into the second half of today's class. Okay, about another 10 more seconds. 5 seconds if you want to answer. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. So most people got that correct. Yes, it's 1968 with the National Flood Insurance Act. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break and come back at like 10:02 if that works for everyone. Just go ahead and go to the bathroom, get a drink or whatever, and then I will meet you back here. So I hope everyone is back, and we will continue with the second part. And so I think I might go back a few slides just to kind of cover a little bit more on levy accreditation. I thought I may have been just kind of rushing a little bit for the timing, but I think it is worth just going over quickly. As I said, freeboard. So it's typically 3 feet of freeboard, and then protecting from erosion and having foundation stability, settlement. And so again, it's ongoing work to keep a levy certification and making sure that it is actually safe. And again, there's always water trying to work its way through with the seepage and the sand boils. And so like Coffeyville is actually talking about improving their levy and doing work on that because again, a failure is a major disaster. So I just wanted to go back to that. And then, so we're kind of moving into permitting at this point. And so it is a good idea to just keep an eye on your floodplain and try to watch out for new development there and look for any publications or postings about new development that might be in your floodplain, because it's really common to have people that don't apply for permits and just to have unpermitted development going on, which is technically a violation. So all development in the floodplain is supposed to have a permit. And so we deal with larger corporations sometimes, like oil and gas drilling. And so they might apply for some permits, but a lot of companies and other developers are just unaware that floodplain permits are their own permits that have to be applied for, and really they should be the last step before they start their development. And so you should ideally hold off on giving your permit until you have all the other permits and documentations that you would need to verify compliance. And so they might apply for like one of the intent to drill permits and state permits and maybe USACE and other federal agencies, and then just kind of skip the local permit. And so this happens frequently where we've seen people get the Corporation Commission of Kansas permits, and then they just start developing without getting the floodplain permit. And so my previous supervisor, Steve, had this happen when he was a floodplain administrator. There was oil drilling in the floodplain, or there was floodplain on the property, and so he was able to reach out before they started to let them know that there was floodplain on the property, and then work out a way for them to be able to do their development without intersecting the floodplain. And so that's something that happens frequently where there's floodplain on the property, and then usually the floodplain administrator will just advise them to stay out of the floodplain if they can. And so that any development that they're doing would not interfere with floodplain rules. But again, if it does, then you would need a permit. And so it is worth doing the legwork to investigate new work going on in the floodplain and any potential work, just so that you can correct violations before they happen, because it's easier to fix something before it's happened. And as soon as you find out about something, you do have to do the enforcement on it, because you don't want this to happen. As I had just talked about the Coffeyville disaster in 2007 with all the oil and gas going into the floodplain, we just had a pipeline leak into the stream recently. And so having that containment and the cleanup and everything is just something we would like to avoid if possible. And so these types of drilling operations would be best left out of the floodplain. And so it kind of depends on what kind of company you're dealing with. Utility companies have been pretty good and proactive about getting permits. We've been working with other pipeline companies just to do maintenance. And so even if they are just doing maintenance, again, any development is supposed to have a permit. So it should have a permit. And you make it a condition, like for a pipeline, that if they're going to go underground, that they restore the ground to the way it was before. And so often these companies will have contractors that go out and get all of the permits that they need. And so that's typically who you'd be working with. Again, utility companies historically have been pretty good. Telecommunications company, not as good historically. And then the same thing goes for companies that sometimes just deliver ready-made structures like sheds. And so that happens often where they'll just deliver a shed, and sheds pop up in the floodplain all the time. And so those are supposed to either be elevated or be permitted for wet floodproofing. And so a lot of them are not ready-made, equipped with flood openings and that type of thing. So letting those companies know that are in your community about floodplain rules and just notifying them can kind of help you mitigate any upset property owners that say they didn't know about it. Just having correspondence and doing that outreach is really worth your time. To let people know, I think it would be a good idea just to do annual outreach to them, just to let them know that permits are required, and that way no one can really say that they weren't aware of it. And then just saving that correspondence and doing the outreach so that you can avoid people that just honestly didn't know about floodplain rules, because that is pretty common. So again, activities that require permits is all activities. So this is a chain link fence. And so we're often seeing stuff like this, chain link fences, where people definitely don't think they need permits because they will let water flow through. And so this was in the floodway, and it became clogged with debris and did become an obstruction. And so any fence in the floodway is going to need a no-rise certificate. And so I will talk about that, but basically any development in the floodway requires an engineering study that proves that that development is not going to cause a rise in the base flood elevation. And it can be very expensive, and it's a requirement. There are really no exceptions to that rule. And even just telling people that and having that in place can deter them from developing the floodway, which again, ideally, we would want to keep the floodway free from any encroachment whatsoever, just to convey floodwaters, but it happens. And so we have these higher design requirements in place. And so in this example, this was the only part of the fence that was left standing after the flood came through. This became an obstruction and the rest of the fence was ripped out. So it is higher risk to develop in the floodway, which is why we have these standards in place. We've seen other people in the floodway that were on higher natural grade, and we just were able to keep them out of the floodplain and just keep them from developing there, because again, just going through the requirements of what's needed to develop in the floodplain and the floodway can deter people, which is, you know, what would be preferable to just not have that there. So yeah, fences do need permits, and if you're doing the legwork to get these smaller permits, it can make getting the bigger permits done a lot easier. So if people are aware of it and that you're consistently enforcing these rules, even on the smaller projects, it will make compliance on the bigger projects a little bit easier. And so permitting is one of the community responsibilities. Of course, we designate someone to be the floodplain administrator. And those duties can be delegated to other staff members. It doesn't have to be that person, but they are officially the floodplain administrator. And so we have communities that split the duties up between 2 and 3 people in a larger community, or sometimes it's just part of your job as you know, your regular title as the city clerk or the planning director or the zoning administrator. And so that person technically has these responsibilities as the floodplain administrator to adopt the ordinance. And so I work with communities all the time to adopt new ordinances or to update them, amend them, whatever the case may be. And then that is your regulatory document that dictates what exactly the floodplain rules are for that community. Of course, all of them have to meet the FEMA minimums and the state minimums for doing floodplain management. That and requiring permits. So all of the ordinances say that any development in the floodplain requires its own permit. Not all of them are difficult permits to do. Like someone putting in a new driveway slab, that is something that would need a permit, but it doesn't mean that permits have to be difficult. It's just to keep documentation of all the development that goes on in the floodplain. And so that is a requirement of the NFIP. So a lot of people don't know that. You can exempt very small projects like roof maintenance from needing a permit if it's something really small like that. Because if it's not specifically exempt, it should have a permit. And so that's where written administrative procedures come in that kind of accompany the ordinance and can be helpful to you in you know, managing your community if you have it all written and put in writing, and then it helps you to remain consistent. And so that also means reviewing permit applications to make sure that things are reasonably safe from flooding. And those words, reasonably safe from flooding, are in the ordinance. It's in the CFR, and it means that it complies with your ordinance standards, which means that we have residential and non-residential structures with their lowest floor elevated above the base flood elevation. Again, statewide, it's 1 foot of freeboard. It could be higher than that. So those buildings have to be either elevated or non-residential buildings can be dry flood proofed. And so I do have some slides on that for tomorrow, but that's not a very common methods that's used. And then conducting field inspections. And I think this is something that kind of gets missed a lot, or people just don't do it, but you really should be doing field inspections for new buildings to make sure that when the foundation is going in, that it's high enough. And so that may be something you want to work out with the property owner on their construction schedule when the foundation is going in, so that you can work with the developer to make sure that it's high enough, because it's a lot easier to fix an elevation problem before the entire building is completed. And so ideally you'd be doing several inspections throughout the construction process and then doing periodic inspections afterwards, which I understand is asking for a lot. And so I don't think most people would do 3 inspections or have the opportunity to do that many, but at least 1 or 2 would be, best. And then we have to have finished elevation certificates to document that compliance and then review that certificate to make sure it is actually compliant. And so that is written into all of the ordinances that you have finished elevation certificates. Some communities require an under construction certificate as well, to make sure that you're at least starting off with building plans that are compliant, so that you're working with them through the entire process to make sure that you're not just kind of blindsided at the end of the project. Carefully considering requests for variances. And so variances are a very tricky subject to deal with. The community does have the authority to either grant or deny requests, but really, if you are considering all of the criteria, it shouldn't happen very often, and very few cases actually qualify for it. So I get questions a lot about variances and how they can be used in specific situations, and usually my answer is no, but again, the Board of Appeals has the authority on that. And then resolving non-compliance and violations. So as soon as we find out about a violation, we have to deal with it. And this can become more difficult with older violations. So there is a statute of limitations on this type of crime. So it's usually about 5 years, depending on the nature of it. And so we do have a couple of classes on violations. If you have questions about that, we have 2 one-hour classes on different aspects of dealing with violations. And so it is one of the more difficult jobs that a floodplain administrator has, with the most difficult one probably dealing with a full-on disaster, where violations are common with that as well. So we have all of these different topics kind of broken down. If you want more detail on these things, check out our training page. And of course, I'm always here for any questions or help. But yeah, community responsibilities. Lastly, here we have updating FEMA. So you would really be reaching out to us if you need any flood map updates. So I ask communities all the time if there's any issues with their flood maps. If any annexations happen, especially if they're in the floodplain, if you would send us that information, that helps us keep updated jurisdictional boundaries and making sure that you adopt all of your map panels that you need to adopt at the time that you're adopting new maps or updating your ordinance. So yeah, just reaching out to us, letting us know. We're always happy to help with any questions or any situations that come up. And so again, with the permitting is probably your most common day-to-day function of the floodplain administrator, is getting permits. And this, clearly depends on how much development is going on in your community and specifically in the floodplain. So some communities are developing faster than others. Some are, not developing at all, and so they don't deal with it very much. But again, any man-made change, so that's any development. So that includes additions to an existing building, new buildings, substantial improvements are important to document. So basically, if you have an improvement to an existing building that is 50% or more of the market value, then it has to be brought into compliance with your current regulations. And so getting the cost of an improvement is an important thing to document on your floodplain development permit. And that is one other important function of the permit. There should be somewhere on the permit that says how much the improvement actually costs. And so keeping documentation of that, placing manufactured homes, subdivisions, temporary buildings is another thing that people don't get permits for. Of course, it needs a permit. Everything needs a permit. Tiny houses are something that we've seen that doesn't get permitted. Basically, any kind of work in the stream is clearly going to need a permit. As I mentioned, accessory structures pop up all the time without getting permits, but there are standards for having those in the floodplain, which again would be elevated or wet floodproofing. The same thing goes for agricultural buildings. So FEMA recently clarified that agricultural structures have to have a variance to be allowed to be wet floodproofed. And so accessory structures can be verified by just a permit to be wet floodproofed, whereas agricultural buildings are too diverse in nature to allow that. And so FEMA has clarified that they want all of them to have variances. And that's something kind of new that has come across our attention in the last couple of months, where it was a little bit different before FEMA put out these clarifying documents and statements. And so just making sure that I try and make that as clear as possible, because you know, there was some confusion before that. And so really, it would be best to adopt into your ordinance standards for accessory structures and agricultural buildings if you're going to allow them to be wet floodproofed, to just have that language in your ordinance. And so we are actually working on updating our state model ordinance. Just as an FYI, we are working towards making it very clear what's required for that, but I just wanted to point that out. Parking or storage of recreational vehicles, there are specific standards for that. They can only be on the property for 180 days or less. And so as long as you move it around a little bit and make sure it's highway ready, that's fine. Otherwise, it would have to meet the same standards as a manufactured home. As I said, temporary stuff still needs a permit, which includes storage of materials and equipment. Something else that we see commonly not permitted, of course, roads, bridges, culverts, any work in the stream, such as grading, excavating, mining, and dredging, that kind of stuff is gonna need a permit, obviously, but likely other permits as well from state and federal agencies. So any alteration to a stream channel, for sure, it's gonna need a state permit and likely a use-based permit for working in a stream. So actually changing a stream channel and a floodway is a really big deal and a large project, and you might need a CLOMAR and a LOMAR for that type of work. And so, you know, having a project like that, having a violation like that would be a very big problem. So again, that's kind of tying back to doing outreach and making sure that people are aware that they can't do this type of work without getting all of the proper permits. And so maintenance and replacements, as I mentioned, like people doing roof work and stuff, is something that could be exempted, but maintenance is another thing that goes unpermitted a lot of the time. If someone is doing interior work to a structure and not changing the building footprint, it's not as big of a deal, but it should still have a permit to document, you know, the improvement costs for substantial improvement standards. And so, yeah, kind of a lot going into that, a lot of information here. Key steps to doing permit reviews. Of course, the first question is, does it need a floodplain permit? Is it in the floodplain? So checking the map, checking that site location, what zone it's in, And then depending on the type of work, other state and federal permits. So as I mentioned, those should be acquired first and then your permit issued last. So you can make it a condition of your permit that they get the other permits or in process of doing that, but it's really best to withhold it until they have that. And so that can also tie into the certificate of occupation and having other building departments withhold their permits until you have everything that you need. And so I will talk a little bit about interoffice coordination. But if you do need further information on state permitting, as I said, stream obstruction or putting fill in the floodplain. So usually like on average 1 foot or more of fill in the floodplain is going to need a state permit. And so that would be Janelle Phillips with our Manhattan office. And that's the phone number there. So I'm referring to her often with new projects just to get a determination on that. And so that is separate from NFIP permitting and the NFIP program. That is a state stream obstructions program. So just being aware of that and that is probably another common permitting situation that you'll end up in as a floodplain administrator. And then of course, reasonably safe from flooding means does it comply with the ordinance, freeboard, proper flood venting, flood damage resistant materials, having proper anchoring, all of that. And then does it show the base flood elevation? So everywhere in Kansas is required to have the base flood elevation developed in the regulatory floodplain in participating communities. So that means zone A projects are going to need a base flood elevation developed. Does it show the existing ground contours? That's important information to have. Again, substantial improvement of a structure, especially older buildings. So you will need access to market values of structures. And so that's something that you could find in property tax records, just making sure it's for the structure and not the land included. So I do have classes on substantial improvement and damage and post-flood disaster stuff. So we have some upcoming classes on that if you're interested. But being prepared for disaster and having that information on hand is going to be important to do before you have a flood, and documenting substantial improvement and making sure you're enforcing those rules as well. What kind of an addition is proposed? Is it vertical? Is it lateral? Is it structurally connected? Is it not? Is it on a post or pre-firm building? Because all of the rules are going to apply differently. Does the addition itself have to be elevated, or does the entire house have to be elevated after that? So, you know, taking a look at that and understanding what's being proposed and then what rules are going to apply to it. And it can be complicated. Again, substantial improvement and damage are kind of their own separate subject that are part of this, that again, we do have classes on that. Of course, I'm here to help work through any situations. Manufactured homes have to be properly elevated and anchored. Does it show an appropriate and safe foundation? And so a lot of people want to have basements in Kansas. They are concerned more about tornadoes and flooding, but new basements are not allowed in the floodplain. And so, yeah, no basements unless you're part of the basement exemption program, which has specific standards on how that's done. And so we only have about 10 communities in that program, and most of them are not still permitting basements anymore. So if you see a proposal that has a basement, definitely put the brakes on that. It's a red flag. We'll talk a little bit more about low RFs later on, but it's a common thing for people to want to put a fill pad in and then dig a basement, also not allowed. So looking at that, making sure that there are no basements, or basements will not be created by adding fill to a foundation. And so just really looking through the permit and the application and looking at what's being proposed, what's already there, and what rules apply is the foundation of doing the floodplain management. And have they agreed to submit an elevation certificate? Obviously, that is documentation that's required. And it says that in all of the ordinances as well. So watching out for these red flags. carefully reviewing the permit for these things. And so this is our sample floodplain development permit that we have. I can send it to you if you'd like to see a template, or if you think maybe your permit application might need something. So having complete information. So step one, and I do have an entire class just on permitting, is making sure you have a complete application, because otherwise, if there's information missing, we're going to have to get back with that applicant and find out what that information is. Rounded off base flood elevation, something that we see very common from engineers and surveyors alike, is just them taking the BFE from the firm panel, which again is rounded, or they'll use the downstream number to calculate a base flood elevation because it's a little bit lower. That's something to look out for. We have had issues with some people, floodplain administrators, that are just really busy, and so they will sign off on a permit without really reviewing it, and that is definitely not the way to go. Floodplain administrators are often stretched thin because they have other duties outside of the floodplain, and I do hear that a lot. So again, if you have questions, if you need any assistance, we're here for that. Not accounting for the full cost of improvement. So again, you might need an itemized list of what those improvements are. And this ties back into substantial damage. If it is damaged from any cause in the floodplain, we have to evaluate the cost of repair to its pre-damage condition. So they're kind of one and the same thing. And some communities just require them to provide an estimate, a detailed cost estimate from a licensed contractor, and that might be something to put in your written administrative procedures. Not getting a state permit, Janelle will send out a violation letter to people doing work that should have had a state permit and they didn't get it, and so that could cause a stop work order. Again, making sure that they have these state and federal permits for applicable projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about endangered species and some of these other permits that might be applicable, but I do have like handouts on what type of work might require what permit. So if you want access to that, let me know. Which anything I've talked about today that you'd like to know more about or need resources, I'm happy to provide that. So again, you have that number there for DWR for a permit determination. And as I just mentioned, the Endangered Species Act is something that's been really heavily emphasized by FEMA in the last couple of years. And so getting that documentation, that is actually pretty simple to do to get a determination on that. It especially comes up with LOMAR Fs and other applications that have a community acknowledgement form. So that goes back to the letters of map change that we discussed before. And I do have a LOMA and LOMAR-F class coming up in a couple months. So permitting continued. It's important for you to understand your regulations because of course you have the federal standards in there as well as the state standards and then any local standards that apply. And so being able to fully explain to property owners how those rules apply and why is an important thing to be able to explain to them why they have to comply with it. And so again, ensuring that permits are applied for, informing the public that permits are required. And so putting out brochures around the city, and I recommend having just like an annual mailing about this, putting it on social media, whatever kind of outreach you can do to make sure that they are informed, and so that you don't have people just building because they honestly don't know, which is another common thing that we see, is just people not knowing that they needed a separate permit. Or getting mixed answers from different departments in the community. And so having this inter-office review process and working with other departments and having the inter-office sign-off procedures so that you can make sure that everybody's on the same page with development, because things in the floodplain are often needing other permits from other departments in your community. So just having that communication and making sure you're on the same page. We have had one department issue a violation at the same time a different department gave them their certificate of occupancy, which created a lot of confusion. So just making sure you have a consistent message and making sure people are applying for permits. And processing permit applications in a reasonable amount of time, otherwise people won't apply for the permits. Taking enforcement actions, so investigating complaints, and a lot of floodplain management stuff comes up when there are complaints. When you have disputes between neighbors, they start complaining about each other and developments that they've done in the floodplain, or you make them get a permit and then they say their neighbor didn't have to get a permit. And so we have had situations like that that really just opens up a whole can of worms where you have to enforce a whole bunch of violations. And so I would encourage you to check out our violations classes, because we talk about meeting with people and citing violations, violation letters, going to court, which could be a result of an ongoing violation. We deal with violations all the time. Recently, we've had a lot of letters of map change that were denied. And so if those are denied, FEMA will let us know about any potential violations, and then we have to enforce them or get the floodplain administrator to enforce them. So definitely something you're likely to deal with. But again, reviewing the entire application and sharing that information with other applicable departments in the community, collecting the permit fees, identifying deficiencies, getting that information, and then approving or denying the permit and letting them know why it was denied in writing can help you avoid any liability or future complaints if you explain it, which again goes back to understanding your regulations. Oh, okay, so doing inspections, as I mentioned, is something that should be part of your permit process, and it should say on your permit that they are giving you permission to enter the property to do inspections, and hopefully you can work out a time with the project timeline that works. Maintaining records in perpetuity, so you want to maintain all of these records indefinitely. And so we will probably be asking for them if we do an audit on the community floodplain program. So we have any number of ongoing audits throughout the year, and we start new ones each year. And so making sure you have those records for us. So we do audits and FEMA does their own audits sometimes. So maintaining your flood maps, having those on hand. So there should be somewhere in your community designated as the flood repository where the public can come and see it. The same thing with your ordinance should have copies for the public available somewhere, usually City Hall. And then maintaining your permit forms and making sure that they are updated, making sure your ordinance is updated. If it's been more than 10 years since your last update, we recommend doing an update on that. Again, we are working on our state model ordinance at this time. And then again, coordinating with the other departments in your jurisdiction. So something that needs a floodplain development permit can often need health, building, electrical, other types of permits and reviews by these departments. So that's where the inter-office routing and sign-off procedure come in. And then making sure those offices maintain that turnaround time. It is a lot of work, but it is important to make sure that things are processed on time. Ensuring that the staff understands the roles and follows those procedures and make sure that they are reviewing things in a timely manner. And then advise the applicant on the other permits that might be needed. And then, of course, if there's any type of alteration or relocation of a water course, you should be letting us know about a project like that. Or at least doing the CLOMAR and LOMAR process that would be required for something like that. And then that is how FEMA is notified about it. But of course, that's something that is likely probably definitely going to need a state permit. So just thinking about that, there are some preliminary steps to permitting that you can take that might make it a little bit easier for you, because applicants might be reaching out to you for copies of the permit to understand the regulations that apply. They might ask about the NFIP maps and their flood zone. So all of that information can be discussed with them either in a phone call, or you can make it into a pre-application meeting with the developer and the applicant to review the plan and go through all of those regulations and other permits that might apply. And just having that communication with the applicant might help them prevent mistakes or any delays that can happen, because people do get frustrated with delays, but at least starting off knowing that beforehand can help. Explain the inspection process, and then you are at this meeting so you can work out the schedule for that. When the foundation's going in, that might help streamline that process and let them know about the inspections. If they have missing information, they can provide it to you right then, or know that they need to provide it for you. And so this can just kind of streamline the entire permitting and inspection process. And so hopefully you can have an open communication and working relationship with them. Property owners can be difficult and are, the main problem for floodplain management issues and violations. And so I have helped floodplain administrators deal with disgruntled property owners. And so I've been yelled at a few times about it. So that can happen, but if you do have to deal with a violation, we can kind of provide backup for you and, tell them that we're kind of making you enforce these rules or to correct a violation. So just let us know about that and can help get compliance a little bit better if you have, the state of Kansas standing with you. So just let us know. We're happy to help with any difficult situations like that. And as I mentioned, the Endangered Species Act is something that has come up more frequently in these last couple of years because FEMA has been getting sued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services for violating the executive order to verify compliance. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, or USFWS, and the Marine Fisheries, so those are the agencies that administer the Endangered Species Act. So just making that clear, hint on that. So because FEMA was violating this rule, they ended up in several lawsuits. There's at least one in Washington, a couple in California. And so that has been in litigation for several years, and FEMA is working through that and has been promising new guidance for how this should be done, because it's a little bit unclear right now, but litigation takes a long time. So hopefully we do get more guidance on that, but getting a determination on this is actually pretty simple and straightforward. And so you might need to verify this, not typically in developed areas, but like in unincorporated areas, it could come up, or just areas of floodplain that are not developed could potentially be habitat for an endangered species. And so you don't want to run into an issue where you have accidentally taken from these species, because it could be a very big deal. And now FEMA has kind of pushed the responsibility on to community officials to verify this instead of FEMA, again, because they got sued. And so they're trying to work out how this should work. And so I have a couple of tools for you, but really, if you need the official determination, it should be pretty easy. And then I will definitely be letting everyone know if there is new guidance on the ESA. So Endangered Species Act is ESA. I should have said that. And so this is IPAC. So this is one of the resources that we have. It is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services website. And so this is the information for planning and consulting. So basically you can go in here, make a profile, give an overview of the type of project that you're doing, and then this will just generate a letter letting you know if there might be a species impacted. And so this is just one of the tools that we have, but we have gotten mixed answers on whether FEMA will accept this as verification of the compliance with the ESA. They also have the Fresh Map. So this is the flood risk and endangered species habitat mapping tool that was just released a couple of years ago. And so it's just another tool to help visualize the ranges and habitats that are in the SFHA. And so they have the floodplain layer in here as something you can overlay with these species so that you can see where they intersect to help local officials make complex decisions. help you with your awareness and assistance with identifying these species and habitats. If you're in the community rating system or thinking about joining, I know some of you are, there's a new activity under 510 for a species assessment and floodplain species plan and assessment, basically. So it's a two-part credit that you can get under the new 2021 addendum. So just making you aware of that. But this is another tool we have for visualization on what issues you could potentially run into. But the data from this is from 2019. So it's a little bit outdated from a couple of years ago, but they do have guidance on how to get that credit and make the plan. Another resource we have is the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks website. They have a county by county list. But basically, if you need an actual determination, and I should have had their information in here, but we have a Manhattan field office for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and so you can just send them an overview of the project, include a map, and give that description, and they should be able to give you a determination based on that, whether or not you need a permit or whether or not any endangered species would be impacted, and then you can save that correspondence as proof that you verified it. So that's the official way to do it until such time that we get future guidance that might tell us something else. I do have that contact information should you need it. And then again, if you are ever concerned about a project, you can just get that determination and then rest easy that you did verify it. So communities have to retain these records permanently. That is part of the deal, that you are documenting all the development. And this will be important, again, as you go through audits, or as I said, FEMA might flag a letter of map change. So it might have nothing to do with anything that you are aware of. If someone applies for a LOMA and they find a potential violation, they will reach out to you to let you know that they found this violation, and then you would have to deal with it. And so having these historical records can help you figure out the situation and find a solution. And so we have been dealing with a situation similar to this that happened back in the 90s. And so we have to kind of reach back and look at the maps that were in effect at the time, the base flood elevation from that historical map, and then determine if it was originally built out of compliance or if it's just a new map. And so there's all these little caveats that can happen, and having these documents on file permanently will help you to figure these things out. And it should, it's a requirement to do this. So you should have it, on file, hopefully backed up in a couple of places, somewhere where it's clearly labeled and not going to be thrown out or lost if you're keeping the hard copies. So we had an issue with this where the floodplain administrator went on vacation, and then they were kind of cleaning the office while they were gone. And then they just had a box with all the floodplain stuff in it, and they just threw it out because it wasn't labeled. And so they lost all of their records. And so that was a difficult thing to deal with when we did the audit with that community. And so you don't want to end up in that situation. And FEMA will definitely be concerned if you don't have any records. So probably keeping it somewhere on the cloud, and then you might even want to encrypt it because there could be privacy issues. And so just being aware of that and making sure that you have it all stored and backed up somewhere, hopefully organized by property is the way that FEMA recommends doing it. So that would include your permits issued, copies of the variances granted, even variance requests and denials should be kept. Your no-rise certificate for sure, to make sure that you complied with the floodway encroachment rules, any watercourse alterations, floodproofing certificates, engineered opening certificates. And so I'll probably talk more about that tomorrow, about flood venting and wet flood proofing, substantial improvement and damage determination. So again, having that documented on the permit, or substantial damage, you have your assessment documentation and then an official letter of that determination. And as I said, those two are kind of their own things, but we want all of the records for that saved somewhere. You have your letters of map change. FEMA has those, and we also keep them on a searchable map. That's a lot like the floodplain viewer we looked at. So you should be able to find copies of those or look to see if a property has a map change, but those should be kept. Elevation certificates for sure, especially if you're in the CRS program, they ask for those annually. And then any copies of state or federal permits, and as I said, like a determination from the US Fish and Wildlife Services on needing a permit. And so having all of this documentation kept somewhere on file permanently, because someone might need to see it, we might, or FEMA, or you. So paperwork is very important for your community. So document everything and just keep it filed away. And then another thing is clarifying what these terms mean to a property owner, because people have different understandings of terminology. And so it's just something to be aware of, that we need to clarify what these terms mean. So the lowest floor is like the lowest floor, including a basement, even if it's an unfinished dirt floor, that's the lowest floor. And so we had a situation where someone thought the top of the bottom floor would mean the ceiling of the basement, when it really means the floor of the basement. And so that led to a misunderstanding that was very expensive for the property owner, and they had to fill in that basement. And so these miscommunications happen all the time, which is why I encourage people to just explain it maybe a couple of different ways to make sure that the meaning is clear, because people that don't work in floodplain stuff, property owners might not be familiar with these terms that we use, like first floor height. So that's a new term for insurance, which means the lowest floor that's above the adjacent grade. And we'll talk more about insurance, but just trying to be as clear as possible, because people can and will misinterpret what you're saying. So, and that can lead to violations that could be avoided just by doing that different explanation. So I know it's a lot to take in and maybe a lot on your plate, but it does help you down the road by avoiding these types of violations. And so when Steve was a floodplain administrator, when he did permits, he would give out some of the FEMA publications and guidance to property owners. And so that might be a good idea to give them some of the new documentation. So some of it is, or most of it is all digitalized now. You might have to look for some things that are out of date as far as like insurance under risk rating 2.0. A lot of the older insurance publications have not been updated as of yet. But aside from that, giving them like protecting your manufactured home is a good publication to have if they, you know, have a manufactured home, or giving them guidance on utilities. And so just giving them that information from FEMA can also help avoid violations. And as I said, we do audits on communities. Every year we open new ones, and we're trying to make progress on old ones. And so we do ask to see permits from the last couple of years. I look around at the aerial imagery to try to look for new development in the floodplain, and then I ask for permits for that and for any other documentation. And then we look at your other aspects of your floodplain program, like your ordinance. We might ask you to update that again if it's been more than 10 years. We look at your map, your permit application, any written administrative procedures, and I do have templates for written administrative procedures if you'd like that. Your no rise certificates, variances, approvals, and requests. And so it's kind of an extensive review. This is the full audit. We also just kind of do brief overviews with communities as well, just to ask a couple of questions like this. So we do these compliance visits with communities just to go through everything, and it's meant to be a learning opportunity to help you, you know, figure it out, get a good hold on everything to make sure that you're, you know, doing it correctly. It's not meant to be a punishment. And then we just kind of work with you to find solutions and fix problems, prevent future damage, and then educate citizens and staff. So, if you get selected for an audit, you don't need to panic. A lot of people hear the word audit and they get a little freaked out, but it's supposed to be a helpful process, and it also makes you eligible to join the CRS program if you are interested in that. So moving on, as I said, communities are developing at different rates. Some of these communities are experiencing rapid growth, some of them are in recline. And so just depending on where you are with that, hopefully there's planning going on to try to work with the floodplains and have appropriate growth in that community. And it can, be difficult if you're expanding at a faster rate and you have the urban growth. Of course, urban growth means we have more impervious surface area that can add to flooding issue. And so, as I said several times already, we try to avoid the floodplain if we can. So having a plan like this where we can keep things out of the floodplain and have these smaller lots would be the preferable thing. Anytime you can avoid the floodplain would be better. Again, you might have issues with lending in a situation like this, and that goes back to the LOMA out as shown. And of course, nature doesn't read maps. Lots of flooding and flood insurance claims happen outside of the floodplain or the SFHA. And so that's important to remind people. They can build a basement right outside the floodplain, but that's not a very smart thing to do. And so we try to discourage that and make sure that people are aware that, again, it's the 1% annual chance flood, and larger floods can and do happen. So no one is guaranteed that they won't be flooded outside of the floodplain, and the ordinances also say that. These small protection measures like berms and flood walls can help prevent flood damage, although they don't really help with premiums. That's not something that's considered in the floodplain flood insurance premium, but having these small measures like backflow valves and these earthen berms and some pumps outside and that kind of thing should be encouraged just to prevent flooding and flood loss. So here's an example of a berm in front of a building to help protect it from flooding. And so again, think carefully about variances. I really dislike variances, and I get asked questions all the time. What is good and sufficient cause? And the important thing to think about is that it's for the building and for the land. It's not for the property owner. So anything personal to do with the property owner is not applicable. And so just making sure that your board of appeals understands what good and sufficient cause is. It's about unique soil conditions, irregular lot shape, or some kind of unique geologic conditions that would justify not meeting the ordinance requirements. There's usually some kind of alternative that can meet the regulations and not need a variance. And so this should be evaluated structure by structure and not for multiple lots at once or a whole subdivision. And so these are things that are not good and sufficient cause, such as property value, aesthetic reasons, financial reasons. While that does, it's not something that you want to hear, that people are struggling financially, but we have to consider their long-term safety and the liability that we're presenting to someone. So just really understanding the variance criteria, what is good and sufficient cause, and making sure that people are going to be safe in a flood, because we have to think about the long-term risk to their life and property. So yeah, it should be very rare. So the elevation certificate is the compliance document. It's for a structure. It documents the elevations of the different aspects of this building, what kind of enclosure it has, if it has an attached garage. And so this is an important document, and I just did 3 elevation certificate classes. Those are recorded on the page if you have questions about that. The current form just expired at the end of November, and we should be getting a new form at some point. And elevation certificates are now optional for flood insurance policies. but that is, a separate topic that we'll talk more about tomorrow. But this is basically what it looks like. Section C has all of this information for the top of the bottom floor, the next higher floor, the machinery servicing the building. And so this is something that you would be evaluating for compliance at the end of a construction process for a new structure in the floodplain. And so these are the building diagrams that would be documented in line A7 of the elevation certificate. And of course, anything that is 2A or 2B should not be allowed. Those are true basements that have the bottom floor below grade on all sides. That's not allowed. So if you have questions about the elevation certificate, check out the class, let me know. I'm happy to help, of course. And then this is just an overview of foundation types that are now for insurance. It's basically the same thing. They've just kind of combined the basement and the split levels into their basic foundation types. We used to have rating tables for flood insurance. Those are no longer applicable, so don't bother with those. Risk rating 2.0 takes into account all of these other factors that did not used to be considered. And so now there's catastrophe modeling, previous claims, replacement cost data, other federal sources. And so we can't give them premium numbers anymore. They have to work with an elevation certificate. They have to work with an insurance agent. As I said, the elevation certificate is now optional. And of course, the higher they elevate, the less their premium will be. And so we want to encourage that as much as possible. It has to be done by a licensed surveyor or an engineer. Architects are not allowed to do them in Kansas. And then of course, the no-rise certificate. As I said, any development in the floodway needs this engineering study to prove it's not going to cause a rise. And so it's usually just a written statement by the engineer that says that they did this study. And so you should have that in the backup technical documentation that goes with that. And then they sign and seal with their license that they're certifying that information. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock. We have our second poll question here, and then we will wrap up for today. Okay, so what agency implements the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA? So we'll give you about 30 seconds to answer this question. And then again, if you want credit for today, I do need you to participate in the 2 poll questions. About another 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So yes, that is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, along with the marine fisheries, which of course doesn't really apply in Kansas. But yeah, so most people got that right. It's definitely not KDA. And that really brings us to the end today. I will stop sharing my screen and we can go over any questions that you might have. And then we'll pick up again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but if you want to come off mute and ask anything, you can go ahead. So not hearing anything. If you want to ask anything over email, I'm available anytime. You can call me. I'm happy to help with any floodplain questions. And other than that, if you were here for most of the class and you participated in both poll questions and you'd like credit, just send me an email and I will get that certificate out to you. I don't make them automatically and send them to everyone. So if you want one, just send me a note so I can get that out to you. But other than that, I really appreciate you guys joining us this morning, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Have a great day.